Welcome. My name is Lisa Booth, and I am the Executive Director at the UF Center for European Studies. The UF Center for European Studies is a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence and houses the UF Jean Monnet Chair. Thank you all for joining us today for Dr. Marcel Lewandowski's talk. But before we begin, I want to let everyone know that this discussion will be recorded and available on the UF CES website. If you would like a link to the recording, please email us. Requests should be sent to the Center's Outreach Coordinator, Carla Ruffer, at rufferc@ufl.edu, and you can find her on our website as well. Following the talk, we will have a Q&A session. Participants can submit their questions through the Q&A button on the bottom of your screens. The title of Dr. Lewandowski's talk is Rising Autocrats and Freedom Fighters: How the Populist Radical Right in Germany and Europe Responds to the Corona Pandemic. Today's presentation is the first in our virtual series, Pandemics in Europe: Political and Social Responses, which explores the EU's response to COVID-19 and takes a historical look at political and social responses to previous epidemics in Europe for a comparative perspective. Make sure to sign up for the CES newsletter to learn more about the series and more about our upcoming events. The talk and the virtual series are supported by the EU Erasmus Plus Jean Monnet Chair. Today's talk is also co-sponsored by the UNC Chapel Hill Center for European Studies and the European Studies Center at the University of Pittsburgh, and we're very happy to have them on board. Our panelist for today's talk is Dr. Marcel Lewandowski, who is the DAAD Visiting Assistant Professor at the University of Florida Center for European Studies. Dr. Lewandowski's research and teaching focuses on comparative politics with special regard to parties and party systems, populism in Europe, and the political system of Germany. Before joining the University of Florida, Dr. Lewandowski was a lecturer at the University of the Federal Armed Services in Hamburg. The Q&A session will be moderated by Michael Webb, a PhD candidate in comparative politics here at the University of Florida. His research interests include economic voting, political geography, and populism, and he has worked with Dr. Lewandowski in the past. And so, therefore, without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Lewandowski.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for the introduction, and thank you all for your interest in this talk. What I'm trying to do today is to shed some light on the data we have at hand about, on the one hand, how populist radical right parties respond to the corona crisis in certain countries, and in comparison, and on the other hand, the impact that the corona crisis has on their electoral success. So there's not too much data at hand at the moment. So a lot of the thoughts I can share with you and the considerations that I have are in a way speculative, but I'm happy to discuss them with you afterwards. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to focus on the one hand on the German case with the Alternative für Deutschland, Alternative for Germany, which is a populist radical right party in opposition. And on the other hand, I try to shed some light on the Hungarian case, which is a populist radical right party in government. And we'll see what possible differences are due to these statuses and discuss them afterwards. So what I'd like to do first is I'd like to elaborate a little on the question whether populist radical right parties are really suffering in the crisis in the polls. So let's first look at Hungary. I selected some countries with some very prominent populist radical right parties just to give you some examples. So Hungary, here we have a populist party, a populist radical right party, Fidesz, which is in power, and you can see that also since March, when the crisis began, we can hardly say that the party is suffering in the polls. It's rather relatively stable at an enormously high level. So Fidesz scores at 51%. The other party we can have a look at here is the FPÖ, which is the Freedom Party of Austria, which is the traditional and most successful radical right populist party in Austria. And you can see that, like, after the crisis, in the beginning of the crisis in March, there is a slight idea of the decreasing support in the polls. But what you can see here, and that is something that I would like to highlight, is that it's not the only party that is suffering. You can see the same with the Greens. You can see the same or similar extent of decreasing support with NEOS, which is a left liberal party. And if we look at Italy, we have a very strong populist radical right party, which was formerly in government, which is the League, the former Northern League, and you can see that the party has suffered losses in the polls clearly, but still you can see that it's the leading party. So the support is decreasing, but it's not that it falls back to the second or third position in the polls. And the last party, and this is one of the parties that we are going to focus on in this talk today, is the AfD. You can see that the AfD since March has seen a certain amount of loss in the polls, but so have other parties. That is to an even higher extent. This is true for the Greens. They have suffered a loss since March. And also you can see that there's one party that is gaining strong support, and that is the governing CDU-CSU under Chancellor Angela Merkel. Now, what I would say is that we're not particularly looking at only populist radical right parties suffering. What we are seeing, I guess, is a form of rally around the flag effect. So that means there's a higher support for the parties in government, whereas a decrease in support for all populist parties, including the populist radical right. But that could be something that wears off over time. So we're not looking at something that is going to affect the populist radical right parties forever, if you will. So in order to understand the relationship or the impact of Corona and the response of the populist parties to Corona, we have to at least briefly understand what populism is. So there are other definitions of populism out there. Others would say, well, they wouldn't agree with me at all. There are scholars that rather refer to, for example, a definition by Laclau. This definition, in contrast, is inspired or basically refers to the Müdde, Cas Müdde, a definition, who is a professor at the University of Athens, Georgia. And but again, this is a contested concept, but this is the one I work with. So what is populism? Populism consists of two dimensions. One is the appeal to the homogeneous people. So the people are perceived as politically homogeneous. And those who don't agree with the popular will in inverted commas, they don't belong to the people. The other dimension is the anti-elite or anti-establishment dimension. And the political establishment is portrayed as corrupt, self-interested, aloof, not interested in the will of the people. The populists, in turn, they claim not only to represent the will of the people, but to know the will of the people in the first place without any negotiation necessary. I'll come back to that in a minute. Whether we speak of right or left populism depends on the populist ideological affiliation, which means that it depends on who is depicted as the outsiders. So for left populists, this will be the rich and the wealthy, or a group like the fascists, whoever that would be. And for radical right parties, these would be immigrants, refugees, cultural minorities, also sexual minorities such as the LGBTQI community, and so on. So this defines whether we speak of left-wing or right-wing populism. There's, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, if you think of the Czech Republic, there's also such a thing as a centrist form of populism. But the ideological affiliation of populism is basically the host ideology that populism adapts to. what is important and what also comes into play when we look at the response of populist parties to the corona pandemic is the idea of the absolute sovereignty of the people, which is crucial for populist understanding of democracy. So everything that, be it constitutional courts, be it minority rights and whatnot, is for populists ultimately undemocratic. So they prefer the execution of the pure will of the people who they claim to represent over any constitutional restrictions. That doesn't make them fascist. Fascism is something totally different. So populism is not fascism light, but it leads to something different. On the one hand, it leads to a demand for true democracy. So as we will see in a minute, populists claim to be the redeemers of democracy. They say democracy is in danger. We have a danger of democracy in our country, and we're here to reestablish it. Whereas, on the other hand, populism also serves as a justification of authoritarian measures in the name of the people. And that is, for example, what we can observe in Poland or in Hungary, but to an extent also under the leftist populist government, well, technically it was a mixture of a left and right populist party in Greece. So also in Greece, for example, they claimed that if the law doesn't serve the people, it shouldn't be the law, something like that. So we see that there is one could even say a liberal understanding of democracy interwoven with the core of what populism is. So if we think of these two dimensions, and this is data from manifestos of populist radical right parties in Europe, if we think of these two dimensions, we have to keep in mind that populism is not a binary feature, it's a gradual feature. So this here includes only data or parties from the family of parties commonly known as populist radical right. So you see UKIP here, you see the Swiss People's Party, you see the Partij voor de Vrijheid, Party for Freedom in the Netherlands, you also see the AFD, the Danish People's Party, and so on. So you see that there's a huge difference between these parties in terms of how salient anti-elitism and people-centrism are for these parties at one given point in time. So neither are these populist parties stable in their populist appeal over time, nor are they equal or very similar to each other, maybe. So this is something that we have to keep in mind when we deal with populist parties. So overall, how do populist parties respond to radical right populist parties, in fact, respond to the pandemic? So based on a very interesting report that if you're interested, you should look it up. It's for free and you find it online. I have tried to collect and try to systematically compare the responses of the populist radical right parties based on their status in opposition and in government. I've added some other parties. I added ANO and I've added the FPÖ, who are not included in the report. And you see that these here, Duterte government, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and Donald Trump in the United States, who is by many scholars described as a populist radical right leader. I put them in brackets because they're obviously not European. So you see that they're different in terms of their response. Some parties within the populist radical right demanded for stronger measures of some kind, including the Rassemblement National in France, the Sweden Democrats, and the Flemish Interest in Belgium. There are others in opposition who are opposed to the measures. That applies to the AFD, as we'll see in a minute, to the FPÖ, to Vox in Spain, and the Lega and Fratelli d'Italia. They're both a little erratic, or as said in the report, they're a little volatile. when it comes to the response. There, at one point, the response didn't go far enough for them, and at another, they would oppose them in the name of democracy. That's what they claim. So you can't really assign these two parties to one of the sides. When in government, at least in Europe, we find parties that try to implement strong measures. That applies to the centrist, that's why it's a little brighter, to the centrist populist, not populist radical right, it's a centrist populist party in the Czech Republic, ANO, but also to Fidesz and PIS in Poland. And what I'd like to do now is try to quickly compare two cases, the AfD in Germany and Fidesz. So just real quick, what we see here is that the AfD is the most successful populist radical right party in the history of the German Federal Republic. So Germany is a federal state, comparable to an extent to the United States. Germany has 16 Länder, states, and in the Bundestag election 2017, the AfD scored 12.6% of the vote, which made it the biggest party in opposition under the condition of the Grand Coalition between the SPD and the CDU-CSU, with the CDU-CSU leading. So, just very quick, the AfD was founded in February 2013. It started as a Eurosceptical party, was hardly radical right in its official documents. Throughout its early history, within the first 2 years, internal struggles over the anti-Islam Pegida movement in the city of Dresden led to the rise of the radical right faction within the AfD. In 2015, the relatively moderate leadership under Bernd Lucke, who also played the dog whistle for radical right, but was moderate in his own positions, a new leadership was elected, Lucke was de-elected, and the moderates that rallied around him left the party. In the course of the so-called refugee crisis, the AfD found a new electoral niche because the European topic, its salience for the voters was clearly decreasing. So the AfD found a new electoral niche, and then at that point, or from that moment on, it was also officially turning in a way ideologically into a populist radical right party that is comparable to other parties of that kind, such as in Austria, in Switzerland, or in the Netherlands. I just skipped this here. This is just to illustrate how the focus of the AfD has shifted. What I find interesting is this. So this basically tells us how the AfD is positioning itself in the corona crisis. So on the left side, you do not see a supporter of the AfD, at least not a official one. This is Attila Hildmann. Attila Hildmann is a former vegan chef in Germany who made good money with vegan cookbooks, and has now turned into a conspiracy theorist who claims that, for example, well, you can name whatever you want, and he will mention it somewhere, who claimed that the coronavirus was constructed and designed by Bill Gates. He links it to an aliens conspiracy and whatnot. But he plays the conspiracy theorist anti-establishment card. Why is that important? It is important because in his demonstrations, the AfD takes part. And what you see on the sign here translates as, our basic rights are not negotiable. So that is important with regard to the populist characteristic of the AfD. What does the AfD do? It presents itself as the redeemer of democracy in a time where the government, under the condition of the corona pandemic, turns, as the AfD claims, authoritarian. And let's just see real quick how that unfolded. So in the beginning of the crisis, the AfD did not have a clear position somewhere within the party in favor of the countermeasures, such as for a leader Alexander Gauland. Others were opposed to them, especially in some regional branches of the AfD. lockdown and the compulsory mask that were among the policies of the German government and also in the German states led to the regional branches of the AfD taking sides with anti-corona demonstrations, including the demonstrations of Attila Hildmann. And the main narratives I think we can identify with regard to the AfD here is, on the one hand, as said, they describe themselves as the defenders of democracy. And that is actually what they did also in the European financial crisis and the refugee crisis. They always claim to be the ones that are able to identify a democratic crisis and will then fight to reestablish democracy. So the countermeasures are portrayed by the AfD as the elite's policies to limit citizens' rights. And the second main narrative I would identify is a conspiracy theory. So within the AfD, it's maybe not the official policy of the party or position of the party, but within the AfD, we find conspiracy theorists who are very close to what Attila Hildmann is claiming, who describe Corona as a hoax, a project of the elites and whatnot. And the AfD now tries, this is my interpretation, tries to implement a strategy in which they try to rally these critics and these conspiracy theorists at the same time around them. Whereas in Hungary, this all looks a little different, but they have something in common, which I will turn to in a minute. So just to be sure, Viktor Orban, who is the leader of Hungary, is on the right of this picture. And he is in power since the landslide victory of Fidesz in the 2010 general election. In the literature, populism in Hungary is referred to as authoritarian populism, which is openly and strongly opposed to liberal democracy. Not every populist radical right party is like that. For example, the Danish People's Party is not, the Swiss People's Party is not. In other parties, such as the AfD, we have such tendencies, but that is not something that is the same for every populist radical right party. The Fidesz government is operating on the basis of a nativist and irredentist, and in part authoritarian, as some would claim, constitution that was ratified in 2011. And it has come up with multiple reforms to maintain government control over the media and the judicial system. And this is where some would claim Hungary is turning into at least a de facto democracy. And what is important here is that just as PIS in Poland, Fidesz is referring to the people's will in order to justify what they're doing. And they have used the Corona crisis as an opportunity to introduce an enabling act. Some would even use the German term, the Ermächtigungsgesetz, the enabling act, which extends legislative power of the government during the time of the Corona crisis. So what the act does is it says that the government is able to do whatever is necessary to prevent the spread of Corona. Interesting here is that it criticizes, just as the AfD does, and I'll turn to that in a second, the European Union for linking the stimulus with democratic values. That is what the EU did in the latest stimulus package. It was linking granting the stimulus to to democratic values or respecting the rule of law. That's the text of the ratification. And Hungary is even opposed to that. And that is something that they have in common with the AfD, as different as they might be. Sung Jo Kim describes it as follows, and I'll quote this here: a conspiracist populism of accusing the global mega-rich powers that be, such as Bill Gates or indeed George Soros, of spreading COVID-19, a claim commonly heard in the weekly Corona demonstration in German cities, has not been the message of the Fidesz government. Instead, the latter's accusations have been directed at an opposition allegedly failing to stick with the nation in the moment of crisis. So why the AfD is turning to international elites, a blurry idea of an international elite, Fidesz is turning to a domestic opposition. But still, both have something in common, and I would say this is the following. So we could say, quote unquote, the AfD is like describe themselves as defenders of democracy, and on the other hand, Fidesz could be described by the literature as authoritarian populism. So they might be different, but still there's a common core when it comes to the corona crisis, and that is describing European measures as a threat to the own nation. Even the wording seems to be similar in press releases. The AfD has, for example, and at some point, I don't know whether it was on Twitter or a press release, of a EU dictatorship. And that is something that we also know from Fidesz, who doesn't want the EU to interfere with their domestic democracy or their domestic affairs. So the EU is a common enemy they have, but what we have to acknowledge at this point is that the EU itself is not as important right now for the populist radical right in Europe. So, will populism survive the pandemic? So let me just real quick give a statement on that. Is populism in danger or not? We have talked about the narrative. We have talked about how they have responded in, let's say, programmatic terms in a way, both in Hungary and Germany. But we have also seen the numbers, and we have seen that some do claim that populism is suffering the pulse. Is that true or not? Or what can we speculate based on that? Can populism or populist radical right maybe even capitalize? So I've used some official data here, and you also find this data online. And there's a projected rise in unemployment in the EU 27 and the UK. Why am I displaying this here? So while unemployment is not the factor that explains populist radical right voting, it is one factor that can lead to an increase of support for populist radical right parties. And I would say that could be indeed a window of opportunity for these parties in the future, even if they might be suffering right now. But under the condition of upcoming economic hardships, citizens, some parts of the electorate might again rally around the populists. Overall, I would say whether Corona kills populist parties is too early to tell. Right now, a great deal of the electorate is rallying around the flag. It's not populist only, but many opposition parties that suffer in the polls. But again, I would say there are two windows of opportunity. One being democratic discontent with containment measures, and this is what populist parties, populist radical right parties are trying to capitalize on right now. By the way, that does not apply to the populist radical left. Populist radical left parties in the countries are mostly supportive of the countermeasures. And the other window of opportunity that might be is the economic effects of the crisis that might come up in the future. They might be supporting citizens voting for populist radical right parties as they did in other crises before. Thank you very much, and I am looking forward to your questions.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michael Webb. I'm a graduate student at the University of Florida, as Lisa mentioned. Now is the opportunity for people to ask their questions, and so I would just invite anybody who has one to submit it through the Q&A response mechanism, which should be down at the bottom of your Zoom window. And Lisa, sorry, were you gonna, sorry. Okay. So I guess while we wait for those questions to come in, I have a few questions of my own. So thank you very much for that really interesting talk, Dr. Lewandowski. And I think the first question I'd like to ask is just in relation to what you closed on with the rally around the flag effect. It seemed to me that, and I just speaking as an American who's watching this happen in the United States as well, not every country is rallying around the flag in this moment with the governing party. And so I'm just curious whether or not you think there's a certain degree of a performance requirement for the rally around the flag effect to take place, and whether or not this could be sort of a litmus test for populist parties that are in government right now, and whether or not we'll see a sort of divergence between those who succeed and those who fail.
I think there is another question in the Q&A, so we could collect that too, and I answer to both of them.
Sure, yeah, so I can just read this out for everybody. Christina asks, in the case of Germany, how have the different socioeconomic opportunities for younger generations in Western and Eastern Germany been used by the AfD to capitalize on this form of discontent? This is not just a current factor, but one which will be built over decades.
Mm-hmm. I'm writing this down, so give me a second, please.
Cool.
Because I have a real bad memory, sorry. Okay, is there another question? If not, I'd like to answer both of them.
One more.
So, you got one more? Oh, perfect.
Yeah, one more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Charlotte asks, you touched on this earlier, but I was wondering if we are still seeing the same pushback against the preventative measures amongst the AfD and other similar parties as we do in the US. Has the recent data coming out about their effectiveness changed their tune? Does it differ between countries and parties? And we're getting lots of questions now, so.
Okay, perfect. I answered these three first, and then I think it'll be good.
Cool.
I think I'd like to start with the last one. Thank you, Charlotte, for that question. What I find interesting when dealing with these topics is that there are several similarities in the electorate of Donald Trump and populist radical right parties in Western Europe. And I find this interesting, despite the different political cultures. And what I recognize right now is that the narratives against these measures that refer to my own freedom to be defended against the state interfering here, so it's my health, my freedom, you all know what I'm talking about, right? These are very similar in the United States and in Europe, also in Germany. And that's something that we find with populist attitudes. So we find that populist attitudes are common in the United States in a certain electorate, and there are in Western Europe and also in part in Central Eastern Europe, although the story is a little different there. And a part of populist attitudes is the claim that I am democratic and the others are not. And the state who's trying to interfere with my freedom by compulsory mask, for example, is not a democratic state. And that is also why it's so different to deal with this, because they can always claim where this is not a right-wing argument, this is a democratic argument. This is something that I find interesting, and that makes the cases or the cases of the United States and Europe to an extent comparable in that regard. The other question by Christine, a very interesting question. Thank you so much for that. Yes, the AfD does. The AfD does capitalize on the different opportunities or the difficult opportunities for younger cohorts, especially in Eastern Germany. That doesn't only refer to employment, that also refers to like the infrastructure, especially in the countryside in East Germany, which has been in part eroding over the last decades. And what I find interesting here, and I think that supports what you're implying, I guess, is that the AfD is not so much supported by elderly cohorts. It is supported by middle-aged and younger cohorts, especially in Eastern Germany. So I would say what you're insinuating is true. And Mike, thank you for that. I think you are right. I would agree with you. I would say that this rallying around the flag at one certain point in time is depending on whether the numbers are going down or not. Not when it comes to a specific part of the electorate. So for example, in the United States, whether the numbers are going down or not, there's a part of the electorate that will always support the sitting president. But when we think of average values, I would say that while in the beginning of the crisis, we see rally around the flag effect in many countries, this is depending on how this government performs over time. So in Germany, the numbers are going down. I would even say this rallying around the flag effect is still in effect, and you don't only see that with the AfD. You also see with the left party being declining in the polls. You see it with the Green Party, who was almost leading in the polls over certain months last year. So I would say that depending on the performance, the effect is wearing off in many countries. But it remains stable in a certain electorate of populist leaders that share the views of that leader on the crisis itself.
Great, thank you. So I think we can take a few more questions. We have some. So
yeah.
Shannon asks, should we also expect an anti-minority sentiment regarding the virus spread in countries that joined the US in anti-racism and anti-police brutality protests? You want a couple of them? So
thank you.
Carol asks, you did not discuss the Baltic countries. To what extent do they have right-wing parties, and how effective are they? And then Richard Tate asks, in your view, is current populism reliant on big brash personalities to be sustained, or do these political slants have an ideological basis that will outlive their current proponents?
I had a glitch. Could you repeat that, please? Sorry.
Yeah. Is current populism reliant on big brash personalities to be sustained, or do these political slants have an ideological basis that will outlive their current proponents?
Great. A further question?
Yeah. Heather asks, have the formal political strategies of the AfD changed in light of the corona crisis? Typically, the AfD has acted in a consciously controversial manner. They embraced a strategy in the Bundestag where they typically spin all issues, economics, environment, and climate change, etc., to be about immigration. Has this strategy remained, or has the general consensus amongst mainstream parties made it more difficult for the AfD to follow their typical antics?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
If you don't mind, I would continue with these questions. Carol, super interesting question, but I cannot answer it because I don't have any data on the Baltic states on my head right now. So I won't tell you anything else. I'm not sure whether in the Populismus brochure I mentioned the Baltic states are included. I don't think they are. So there's not too much data on that right now. If it comes up, it might turn out super interesting, but right now I can't tell you too much on that, although there are interesting populist parties there. So sorry for that. Does the anti-minority sentiment come up or even remain? Thank you, Shannon. Yes, it does. Yes, it does. That has been the case, for example, in France with the National Rally, and it has been the case with Fratelli d'Italia and the League in Italy, which are blaming especially in Italy, refugees coming into the country and carrying this disease. And you remember there was an upsurge in the refugee crisis. Nobody's talking about this anymore at the beginning of the Corona crisis as well. And that affected Italy. And in Italy, in Germany, in France, the populist radical right parties have tried to connect the coronavirus spread to the influx, to the uncontrolled, in inverted commas, influx of refugees into the respective country. Interestingly, that has worn off a little. It has worn off to the advantage of these parties now claiming that democracy is in danger by too strong measures. At least this is what some of these parties do, in part in Italy and in Germany. And I'm surprised by that as well. But this is still all in flux. So we don't know whether it will come up again. I'm pretty sure it will. Why is this the case? Why am I sure of that? Well, my speculation is this. Not only are the electors of these parties characterized by populist attitudes, they are also characterized by radical right attitudes. And these parties know that, and they capitalize on these attitudes, so they need something to feed that. And I think it will definitely come back. When it comes to the strategies, I don't know, I think it could combine Richard's and Heather's questions here in a way. When it comes to strategies or counter strategies of the other parties and the strategies of the AfD, I think the other parties are still a little helpless when it comes to the AfD, because the AfD has been able to stabilize at a certain level. We're talking about 12, 11 to 15, maybe even more percent. And the other parties don't really know what to do with that. In Parliament, what they try to do is to maintain an anti-populist radical right consensus, and this has always been the case, also with the NPD and the DVU in earlier years. But the AfD is different, because the AfD doesn't appear, whatever it does, there are fascists within the AfD, but the AfD itself, to a great deal of its electorate, doesn't seem like a Nazi party. A lot of people still say, well, this is a democratic party. So the classic anti-fascist countermeasures don't work against the AfD, which is a problem for the mainstream parties who are used to these classical, I would say, anti-fascist countermeasures, which is demonization and stigmatization. And overall, in general, what we can say is that right now everything is a little on hold. The AfD is declining in the polls, and the other parties are now trying to ignore the AfD. The AfD, in turn, is trying to rally all those different forms of critics and conspiracy theorists around them, and we will see how this works out. At this point, I think it's too early to tell.
Great, so it looks like we have a little bit of time left for a couple more questions. So we have one other question from Charlotte, and then I have another question as well. So Charlotte, how has the CSU been dealing with their succession crisis as the pandemic progresses? This was a big issue last year when AKK stepped down, but I have not heard much about other potential successors and what their plans might be for recovery. Mm-hmm. And then Shannon Scott has also asked, if I recall, the AfD was popular particularly in Eastern Germany, especially due to economic hardships persisting after the Cold War. Do we know if AfD is slightly decreasing in popularity just as much in the East as in the West? And if they become more popular later, do you think it will again be more of a phenomenon in the East than elsewhere? Mm-hmm. Okay, and then my question relates to, you talked about anti-expert attitudes in your presentation, and I was just curious whether or not you see a split going on here, because obviously to effectively address the coronavirus, you have to listen to the recommendations of epidemiologists and sort of scientific findings more generally. And so for those populist parties that are calling for stronger measures which are addressing the coronavirus appropriately, does that reflect an abandonment of this anti-expert sentiment, or is this something else? Is there something else going on here?
Mm-hmm. All right, thanks for these questions. Charlotte, I begin with your question. Yeah, the succession crisis. Well, actually, I would say Corona has brought up both some successors and some potential candidates for chancellorship. So the successors for the leadership of the CDU-CSU right now are basically three candidates. That will be Friedrich Merz, who was a former leader of the Parliamentary Party. That would be the Prime Minister of North Rhine-Westphalia. And the third one would be Jens Spahn. Jens Spahn, who is now the Minister of Health in Germany. And how likely these potential successors are to gain the office depends on their performance right now in the Corona crisis. Friedrich Merz has the disadvantage of not being an active politician right now. So before the crisis, he seemed a quite potential candidate, but right now, it's not quite sure whether he will be able to become leader of the CDU-CSU. I think the most likely candidate would be Jens Spahn, who is now Minister of Health, because the performance of the Prime Minister of North Rhine-Westphalia is relatively poor compared to others, and given the fact that North Rhine-Westphalia is the biggest state in Germany. When it comes to the chancellorship, there are, I would say, two potential candidates right now. Both are, in a way, affected by the Corona crisis, one negatively, one positively. Negatively affected, again, because not an active politician right now, is Friedrich Merz, and positively affected is the leader of the CSU and the Prime Minister of Bavaria, which is Markus Söder. And the last poll about potential candidates for chancellorship showed that Markus Söder was strongly leading also over Friedrich Merz. So it could be that in the future we see a CDU leadership, a CDU leader Jens Spahn, and candidate for chancellorship Markus Söder, which would be the first Bavarian to gain office if he wins. Shannon, I've just looked it up. I looked up the numbers because I don't have them all on my mind. And what I would say from the numbers I get from the polls in the German states is that the AfD is especially suffering right now in West German states, whereas the support is still higher in the polls in East German states. And this can be, the reason for that could be that the anti-establishment and the sentiment and the disaffection or discontent with the given state of democracy and the given elites is so strong that Corona just doesn't make a difference for that stable electorate in East Germany. So that is how I would interpret the polls right there. And Mike, I would say that to an extent, all populists, whether governing or not, whether introducing strong anti-corona measures or not, are anti-experts or are critical of experts because they often don't know what the people want. By the way, this includes political scientists. And they don't think like the people think, and so on. And the same applies to other scientists. So they are part of this intellectual elite. What I think they're doing right now is they're not like presenting or playing this card right now. They're ignoring their own anti-expert sentiment when they're in power. That is not true for every populace in power. So let's just agree for a moment here that what we read in literature is true, and that we could say that the given United States government is populist. So you can see how the government is treating their own expert, Fauci, in the corona crisis, and this is a clear anti-expert sentiment. But others are not trying to capitalize it, and that will be, for example, the case in Hungary. They're ignoring it. It will come up again.
Great, thank you. I think that's all the questions we have, so I'll just turn it over to Lisa to finish things out.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. Thank you, Mike, for handling the question and answer session. We greatly appreciate it. We will be sending around an assessment survey after this to get an idea of our participants and what you thought of the talk, and we really would like to hear back from you. So please do look for that and send it back. And again, keep an eye out on the website. We are going to have more talks on the pandemic and the general EU response. Our website is www.ces.ufl.edu. We will also have announcements on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So keep an eye out for those. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.